All right, here we are, pressing on. We are looking at chapter 70 of A Child's History in the World, called James the Servant, or What's in a Name? I guess we'll see. What does your name mean? If it is baker, or miller, or tailor, or carpenter, or fisher, or cook, it probably means that at some time one of your ancestors was a baker, or miller, or tailor, or carpenter, or fisher, or cook. If your name is Stewart, or Stewart, or Stewart, or Steward, it may mean that at some time one of your ancestors was a steward. For in olden days, people knew very little about spelling, and they spelled the same name many different ways. A steward was a chief servant. There was a family named Stewart in Scotland. And from chief servants or stewards, they had become rulers of the Scots. Mary Stuart, whom Elizabeth had beheaded, was one of them. As Queen Elizabeth never married, she had no children to rule after her. She was the last of the Tudor family. The English had to look around for a new king, and they looked to Scotland. Now, Scotland, as I have told you, was then a separate country and not a part of Britain as now. The son of Mary Stuart was then King of Scotland. His name was James Stuart. As he was related to the Tudors, the English invited him to come and rule over them. He accepted the invitation and was called James I. So we speak of his reign and that of his children as the reign of the Stuarts. The Stuart family reigned for about 100 years, that is, from 1600 to 1700. All except about 11 years when England had no king at all. Many times the English must have been very sorry that they had ever invited James to be their king, for he and the whole Stuart family lorded it over the English people. They acted as if they were lords of creation, and the English people had to fight for their rights. A body of men called Parliament was supposed to make laws for the English people. But James said that Parliament could do nothing that he did not like. And if they weren't very careful, he wouldn't let them do any governing at all. James said that whatever the king did was right, that the king could do no wrong, that God gave kings the right to do as they pleased with their subjects. This was called the divine right of kings. Naturally, the English people would not put up with that sort of thing. Ever since the time of King John, they had insisted on their own rights. The Tudors had often done things that the people didn't like, but the Tudors were English. The Stuarts, however, were Scottish, and the people looked on them as foreigners. What they permitted in one of their own families, they wouldn't stand in these strangers, whom they had invited into their family. So, of course, a quarrel was bound to start. But the real fight came with the next king, and not with James. During King James's reign, the Bible was translated into English. This is the Bible that is called the King James Bible. You guessed it. Nothing much happened in England during James' reign, but in some other countries a great deal did happen, although the king had little to do with it. English people made settlements in India, that faraway country that Columbus had tried to reach going west. And these settlements there grew until India at last belonged to England. England had conquered a large empire and became a wealthy and powerful nation. Settlements also were made in America. One was made in the south and one in the north. Raleigh's settlement at Roanoke had disappeared, as I told you. But in 1607, a boatload of English men sailed over to America looking for adventure and hoping to make their fortunes by finding gold. They landed in Virginia and named the place where they had settled Jamestown, after their king, King James. But they found no gold, and as they were not used to work, they did not want to try to do anything. Their leader, Captain John Smith, took matters into his own hands and said that those that didn't work wouldn't eat or shouldn't eat. So then the colonists had to go to work. Back in England, people had learned to smoke. And so the colonists began to raise tobacco for English people. The tobacco brought the colonists so much money that it proved to be a gold mine. Of a different kind, after all. But the colonial gentlemen wanted someone to do the rough work for them. A few years later, black people were brought over from Africa and sold to the colonists to do the rough work. This was the beginning of slavery in America, which grew and grew until on big plantations in the South, almost all the work was done by slaves. This system of slavery was, of course, very wrong and cruel, but it lasted for several hundred years. Greed lay at the root of this as well as many other evils. A little later, another company of people left England for America. These people were not looking for fortune, however, as the Jamestown settlers had been. They were looking for a place where they might worship God as they pleased, for in England they were interfered with, and they wanted to find a place where no one would interfere with them. So this company of people left Plymouth, England in 1620 in a ship called the Mayflower, sailed across the ocean, and landed in a place they named Plymouth in Massachusetts, and there they settled. More than half of them died the first winter from hardships and exposure in the bitter weather that they have in the north. Nevertheless, none of those who were left would go back to England. This settlement was the beginning of that part of the United States called New England. You'll hear more about both settlements later when you study American history. At present, we must see what's going on in England, for there were great goings-on following the reign of James Stewart. All right, y'all. I think that's it for tonight. I think we'll bounce back tomorrow and pop through 3 chapters too. Ta-ta for now. Good night.